Welcome Volatility Box members to part 2 of our dividend yield tutorial, in which we're going to be taking the same dividend yield indicator that we built together in part 1 and turn it into something a lot more robust. Something that allows us to very quickly in one glance see what the current dividend yield is and put it in comparison to what the dividend yield has been based on whatever data that you have loaded on your charts. Here I have just 5 years worth of data, but you can go all the way back to 20 years if you'd like, and in many cases the max available option to go even further back than what the 20 years provides. Now inside of our label here, if we take a look at an example of PMT, in our free version of the indicator, all we could see was the dividend yield, which is 11.83%. That sounds really nice right now. However, when we put that 11.83% in the context of what the dividend yield has done over, say in this case, the past 5 years, we can see that the current yield of 11.83% is less than the midpoint of 18.71%. So that tells us that, hey, the midpoint is actually above where we're currently trading. The dividend yield has been higher over the past 5 years. We are above the 200 SMA, but barely 11.79% compared to 11.83%. Our year-over-year growth is also negative. All of that to say that this 11.83% all of a sudden doesn't seem as attractive as it may look at first glance. That's what the pro version of the indicator is there to help you do. I think it serves 3 key benefits. They all revolve around saving you time, around allowing you to analyze what the current dividend yield is and comparing it to historical yield quickly, and measuring performance in one quick and easy glance, things like that year-over-year growth calculated already for you. Alright, with that out of the way, let's start diving into code and start writing the pro version of the indicator together from scratch. Now to help us get started, let me remove this pro version of the indicator. I'm going to come into the free version of the code, which you'll need as our baseline to get started, and I'm going to copy and paste everything that we have here, and I'm going to paste that into a brand new indicator file. I'll give this the name TI_Dividend Yield Pro, and now we can get started by writing our own code. Now if we do a quick recap of what we've done so far, we have the code declaring upper, which we're now going to need to change to lower. So I can change that already. Then we have an assert function, which checks to make sure that we're on the daily time frame or higher. Then we have the choice between our 2 different yield calculation types. We have a threshold value, which will probably go away in the pro version of the indicator. We won't need that. We have better metrics to compare it to. And we have the ability to turn our labels on and off, along with the chart bubbles on and off. Now we have the 2 different dividends that we've calculated. The first value is the one that we used from our Thinkorswim example, which carries the value of the dividend forward. So every single bar has a dividend value associated with it, versus this dividend 2 variable, in which all the variables in which there isn't a dividend, that has the value 0 associated with it. Now we have also a total dividends variable, which simply calculates the total number of payouts. And we've also calculated the sum of the previous 1 year's worth of dividend payouts, which I think is the more accurate measure. Now we had a payouts multiplier, which accounted for a special payout. And then if we come down the 2 different calculation types for the dividend yield, the first calculation type, which simply takes the dividend and it multiplies it by, if you have, say, payouts every quarter, by the number 4. The second one takes the real sum of the dividends paid out by the company, and it divides it by the close price to give you a real dividend yield of what the past year has provided. Now, with all of that as our starting point, and we have these labels plotting, if we simply say change this declare upper to declare lower, and I click OK, and we click apply, you'll see that we have nothing plotting on our charts. So let's start to fix this, and we can start to first add in some of the calculations, and then we can also add in the plot so we see the dividend yield plotting on our charts. Now I think the easiest first step that we can do is we can add in the year-over-year growth calculation. The way we can do that is by using this sum past year dividends variable. That variable, by default, we're looking back to get the sum over the past 252 bars. So if, say, for example, we took what is the sum of the previous year's dividends, and we simply just took the sum of this past year dividends variable, but instead of looking for what that value is on the current bar, we looked for it on the 253rd bar on our charts. That would allow us to see what was the dividend in the previous year. So by using that value, we can then create a def year over year variable, which simply calculates what is the sum of the past year dividends, which is this value, the dividends that we had over this past year. We subtract that from the previous year's dividends, and we can then divide that by the previous year's dividends to see what kind of growth we had. If this number's positive, then we know we had positive growth. If this number's negative, then we know that, hey, the dividends actually went down. Now we'll worry about plotting that value in just a second, but let's keep coming down the code and see if there's anything else that we can change here. Now this dividend yield value that we have here, we currently have as a def variable. We want to actually see this variable plotting on our charts. So if we change this def to a plot now, and we click apply, we can see a line plotting on our charts. Now let's give this line some formatting so we control it ourselves. I'll say this dividend yield line, we'll give that a set painting strategy of painting strategy.line. We'll give this a color of set default color, color.cyan, so we can stick with what we have right now. I like those, the feel of how this looks. I just want to be able to make sure it stays consistent every single time. Now that we have the dividend yield value plotting on our charts, if I click apply, we can see that it will plot this way every single time. We can now create one additional value, which is that average plot, which is the 200 SMA value. So now, if I create one more plot variable here, I'll say plot dividend yield average, and we use the simple moving average function, but instead of feeding in the close price as our input value, we feed in our dividend yield value as our input value, since we're trying to calculate what is the 200 SMA of the dividend yield. That should now give us what that dividend yield average line looks like. If we plot this out on our chart, I'll copy and paste both of these two, and this time we're going to change the variable here from dividend yield to div yield average. Same thing here, and instead of making this cyan, I'm going to make this the color light gray. And instead of giving this the same straight line, I'm going to add in one additional formatting filter, which is we're going to make this a dashed line. Now let's see how this looks like on our chart. Now we can see the 200 SMA value of the dividend yield, so it's very easy to spot. For example, when is the dividend yield above our 200 period simple moving average? That's a good sign. That tells you that, hey, the current dividend yield is greater than what the average has been over the past 200 bars. And you can also see when that dividend yield, say, drops below a certain threshold, in which maybe that dividend yield may not look as attractive as what it once was. Now, let's take the same idea of plotting this dividend yield average, and we also have our year over year growth that we have yet to plot. So let's actually add that in as a label before we then move into trying to make sense of this dividend information by tracking the highest and the lowest point. So the first thing that we are now looking to add is our year over year variable, or our year over year label, which allows us to see what is that year over year growth. So I'll say add label here. I'll put this above our check of if the company does pay dividends. And inside of this label, we're going to have the same conditions as we had for our other labels, which is we make sure the user has selected labels on, and we make sure that we're looking for the company to have at least some sort of a dividend payout. Now here, we can calculate, or output rather, our year over year variable. And we can say year over year, actually add in a space so it looks nice and clean. And we already have that YoY variable that we created up here that we can use for our output. So here we can say if our Y over Y variable is greater than or equal to 0, then we're first going to add in a plus sign so we can see that it's in fact a positive year-over-year growth. And to that, we're going to add the value of that year-over-year variable, outputted as a percentage. Now, if that value is not greater than or equal to 0, then we know it's a negative value, so we're going to add the negative sign. And to that, I'll add the same thing as percent year-over-year variable. And then we can also use some colors here where we say if our year-over-year value is greater than or equal to 0, then we'll go with the color.light or light green, else we'll go with our color.light red. Now if I test this out first, we can see our label. I think light red might be a little too dark, so let's change this to pink. I'll click apply and that looks a little bit better. So now we can see that this value is a negative 0.53%, so we have a negative year-over-year growth inside of PMT, or year-over-year dividend yield growth, excuse me. Okay, now let's get back to making some sense of this dividend yield information, where we do something with the highest and the lowest dividend yield that we have on our charts, and we use that to try and section off the dividend yield into something a little bit more useful. So here, let's delete this comment that I currently have, and now I'm going to output out the highest yield and the lowest dividend yield that we have on our charts first. We'll use that to get a sense of where has the dividend yield gone over this period, in this case of the past 5 years. So the first thing we have is the highest dividend yield, and I'll actually plot this out. So I'll say plot highest yield, and I can use the highest all function, which looks for the highest value across all of the values available on this particular time frame, in this case the daily time frame going back 5 years, and it's going to look for, in this case, the highest dividend yield value. Now at that value, let's try and output this value as a horizontal line. So I'll say highest yield dot set painting strategy dot line, and let's, since this is the highest yield, give this a default color of set default color dot green. Let's see how that looks like first. Now if I click apply, on our charts all of a sudden we have a line drawn at 0.33. Our yield was the greatest during this COVID crash right here, and that is what's marking the highest point on our charts, and that allows us to make sense of all of this information by putting it into a scale. If we come back into our code, and now we repeat the same idea, but this time for the lowest yield. So I'll add in one more set of variables here, but this time I'm going to give this the name lowest yield. And I'll say instead of highest all, lowest all. And same idea, we're looking for the dividend yield. Make sure to change this value for the variable that we're using to plot. Lowest yield dot set painting strategy dot line. And for our color here, we'll set this to, let's say, red. I'll click apply. Now we can make sense of where the highest point is and where the lowest point is. Now using the highest and the lowest point, you can obviously guess what is coming next, which is the midpoint. We can plot another point here that we call, say, the midpoint yield. And here we can take for our midpoint the highest yield. We can subtract that with the lowest yield. That gives us the distance between these two. And we can plot a midpoint line by taking, say, the lowest yield, adding it to our highest yield minus our lowest yield divided by 2. And that will now give us a midpoint line. And to that line, if we add in the same little bit of formatting here, we'll say midpoint yield dot set painting strategy dot line, and then same thing, midpoint yield, but this time we'll make our color white. And now if I apply this on our chart, we have a line that goes straight through the middle. Now we can also add in 2 additional lines which divide each of these sections in half, which allows us to have this idea of quadrants. We get to group the dividend yield into 4 different chunks, which I think makes it easier to have 4 baskets to very quickly assess which one of these 4 baskets is the yield currently in. So now to draw each one of those lines, we can say plot, let's call it our Q3 line, or the third quarterly line right here, and we'll call that highest yield minus the, in this case, the same value that we had here. And we can add in the same little bit of formatting. Whoops. Same little bit of formatting, but I'll take this variable. Instead of actually Q3, let's call this upper quadrant. And we'll use that variable for these two. And I'll give this a color.light gray. And let's give this the same treatment of the dash that we gave the average line, where we can paste that in, where the upper quadrant variable now also has a dot set style, which is curve/dash, or curve_dash, excuse me. Now if I click apply, we see nothing on our charts, and that's because I've put in the lowest yield here. Instead of the lowest yield, we want to see this section being divided with the midpoint yield. And now if I click apply, we can see that line coming in right here. Now we repeat the same section for the lower quadrant line. So I'm going to paste this in one more time, and this time we'll change the upper values to lower quadrant, and now we will take our lowest yield, and to that we will add in, it's really the same value, but let's change this formula. We'll say midpoint yield minus the lowest yield divided by 2, and to that we're going to be adding this, and I'll say lower quadrant dot set painting style, and we're going to use the same style across the board here. Click apply, and now we see a horizontal line right down here as well. Now the next function or feature I want to add is the ability to turn off this moving average line. It already looks like it might get bothersome, and I want to be able to let you turn that on and off directly from the studies menu. So we'll add in one more input up here. We'll say input show SMA, and we can set that to a default of no. Now if we come into where we've defined the actual average line here, and we take a look at the code, our plot variable goes straight into actually plotting this line. I want to be able to separate this where there's a special dividend yield average which is connected to our input variable. Only if that value is true do we actually plot this dividend or this average line. But regardless of if we plot it or not, I want to still be able to calculate the simple moving average. So that's why I'm saying we should split them up. So here I might give this a name of something like dividend yield average plot, and I'll add plot to each of these formatting variables here. And now above this, we'll add in one additional value, which is called, say, div yield average. And here we will always say set this value equal to the simple moving average of 200. And now to the plot value, we can say if show SMA is true, which means the user up here has selected yes for the show SMA value, only then do you actually plot the SMA value. Else, if the user has said no, used it as the default value of no, then we're going to plot nothing on our charts. So now if I click apply, you'll notice that simple moving average line goes away, and this becomes, I think, a little bit cleaner on our charts. Now that we have that squared away, let's take a look at what else we can do to try and make this a little bit better. The next thing I can think of that we can do is add in the same functionality of being able to turn these ranges on and off if on the reverse end you'd like to see this only with the simple moving average. So let's create one more value here called input show ranges. This is going to be set to a default value of yes, and we need to repeat something similar here to the highest yield, the lowest yield, the midpoint yield value, the upper quadrant, and our lower quadrant. We need to add in another value that inside of this plot variable stores the value for all measures, and then we have the actual plot being shown based on if the user selected show ranges or not. So we can repeat the same thing that we just did, which is add in the plot variable here. So we'll say plot across the board, And now I'm going to here define a highest yield, which is simply the highest all dividend yield function. And this is going to be if we have, say, show ranges selected, then we're going to display this, else double dot nan, which means show nothing. Now I repeat the same logic for the remaining variables here. So I'm going to come in, create one new variable called lowest yield. We'll set this equal to the value that we have created, and we'll add plot to each one of these variable names right down here. And that now allows us to bring in the show ranges variable here, and we can say else double dot nan. Now we have to repeat this for 3 more sections, and then we are almost at the finish line. So now for our midpoint, we repeat the same thing. So I'll add in the plot variable. We change this plot variable here. We change this plot variable. We do not need to change this since we're going to create instead a yield variable here, which is simply this same value. And here we're just going to add an if show ranges, then we're going to display this else double dot nan. Now we have our 2 quadrant lines. So for that upper quadrant, I'm going to paste in the same code. Then I'm going to add in the words plot here, copy paste this. We're going to add that to the actual plots. This is a little bit of a tedious process, but once you do it once, I think it becomes really nice and clean, which allows you to really have full control over almost every single aspect. So we say if show ranges, then we're going to show this formula, else double dot nan. And then finally our last line here, def lower quadrant. We copy the same formula. We add in our condition here, if show ranges, then, and we're going to say else double dot nan for the condition in which this plot is not true. And we simply add in the word plot. And we attach that to our plot variables. And this should be it. I think we're pretty much done with our Dividend Yield Pro indicator. I think there's maybe some label logic that we might be able to add here. But other than that, if we take a look at what we currently have, we have the ability now directly from the studies menu to be able to turn off ranges. If we say turn it off, then we'll see just the dividend yield. Now if we want to show the SMA, we can see just the SMA line. If we want to turn off the SMA and you'd like to see just the ranges, boom, you get to see the ranges again. Now, what we can do is make these labels a little bit smarter. In our free version of the tutorial, we had this variable called threshold. I'm not really sure that you having a user-defined threshold is the best way to do this. That's relatively arbitrary. Instead, if we delete this, we come back down here. Now, wherever we have these issues with our threshold, we instead use a different check. So for our dividend value here, we ask ourselves the question, okay, is our dividend yield value, let's say, greater than our SMA average? Maybe that's the value that we'd like to be using here. So we'll take our dividend yield average value, the one that's not the plot variable. We come in and we compare, is our dividend yield greater than that value? If so, then color.green, else color.yellow. Now we have one additional place, which is the chart bubble, so we can replace this with the same average value there. Now all of a sudden, instead of having something random, we're plotting what the actual average value is. Now we don't see the average on our chart, so let's go ahead and add what the average is along with the midpoint values. I think those might be some easy references. Adding in every single quadrant line here is, I think, overkill, but adding in this line, the midpoint line, along with where that 50 SMA line is, could be useful in understanding how our current dividend yield stacks up. So I'm going to add in one additional label, labels on, total dividends is greater than 0, the same conditions we've been using for every single label. And now we're going to first output our midpoint, so I'll say mid, and here we can use the value that we have, the midpoint yield, and I'm going to add that in here. And we're going to say if our current dividend yield, so the same logic that we have up here, so if our dividend yield is greater than the dividend yield average, but in this case instead of average we're going to use the actual variable we're using here, so in this case midpoint yield. So if we're above that, then color.light green, otherwise color.yellow. So you can almost use these labels as your check of, hey, are we above the midpoint or are we below it? Are we above the average or are we below the average? So if I click apply, now we can see the midpoint and we can see PMT is currently below the midpoint, which is why this label is yellow. Now if I add in one additional add label, but this time we're doing it for our moving average line, so we'll say 200 SMA, and this time we're going to say inside of this value the dividend yield average, and I will paste that inside of the label that we just created here. And we're going to compare the dividend yield this time to the dividend yield average, and we'll show this color as light green versus yellow. Apply. Now we can see what the current dividend yield is compared to the average. Now we can make these labels a little bit smarter, where we can make our main label here green only if both of these are green, and if one of them is yellow, then this label can say show up as yellow. So if we make that slight additional bit of logic here, so it becomes just one little bit smarter, then we come into our add label, which has all of our dividend information, and to our color check here where we say is our dividend yield greater than our dividend yield average, we can say and dividend yield greater than midpoint yield, then our color is light green, else color.yellow. And now we have our final version of the Dividend Yield Pro indicator built. This is a fairly smart indicator now. If we go to, say, Verizon, we can see the number of payouts, we can see all of our labels are green across the board, and we can very easily see that our current dividend yield is much higher than anything we've seen in the past. If we say contrast Verizon with maybe T-Mobile, or AT&T, excuse me, we can see AT&T, our current dividend yield of 7.67%, while still high, is not higher than our midpoint here. We can also clean these labels up actually before we wrap this tutorial up. So if we clean that up, I'll come back into, say, a chart of Verizon. We'll come back into our labels here, and where we have our 200 SMA plotting as a dividend average, we can say as percent dividend yield average. And then where we have our midpoint plotting, we can say as percent for our midpoint yield. And now those look a little bit cleaner. Alright, hopefully through this tutorial you learned some ThinkScript concepts, you learned how to build the Dividend Pro version of the indicator by yourself, and you learned how to go from something fairly simple like the get dividend function and turning that into something robust that provides you with data which otherwise is actually fairly hard to find. Take care everyone, good luck trading, thank you for being a Volatility Box member, and we look forward to seeing you in our next members only tutorial. Take care everyone.